So if we're at a conference discussing health and technology, we can't not talk about AI. And AI is no stranger to negative publicity. And the latest allegation is that it's out to replace real doctors. So in this next super fireside session, two of the biggest names in the field come together to dispel the myth that it's a case of either or when it comes to artificial and human healthcare. We also have an exclusive demonstration of AI-supported diagnosis in play. Please welcome, in conversation with Quartz editor Georgia Francis King, Medical Director of Babylon Health, Hannah Allen, and Chief Medical Officer at Philips, Roy Smythe.
Good morning, guys. We're here today to talk about and try to dispel some of the myths and misconceptions about healthcare and AI, both the overly positive utopian visions of the future and some of those dystopian narratives that spiral into issues like privacy, responsibility, humanity. The reality is going to be somewhere in between. Not only will AI change the role of doctors, how they, where they are, what they do, how they care for us, but also how we as patients will be diagnosed and cared for. So there are lots of things to talk about, so let's get right into it. Roy, by means of introduction, could you tell me a little bit about the work that Philips is doing and how it relates to this new field?
Sure. So Philips obviously is a company that is working across a very broad front. Everything from consumer devices that promote health and wellness to diagnostics and therapeutics, and then devices and informatics that follow patients home after diagnostic and therapeutic endeavors. And there's really no place along that continuum, basically from birth to aging in place at home, that Philips isn't either using advanced computing, machine learning, artificial intelligence, or is working to use those technologies.
And for you, Hannah, Babylon Health is in a slightly different area of this field. Could you talk a little bit about perhaps the problem that you're trying to solve and how you're trying to solve it?
Sure, yeah. So our mission at Babylon is to put affordable and accessible healthcare in the hands of every person on the planet. And we aim to do that via telemedicine, so digital remote consultations, and also via artificial intelligence methods that can be patient-facing and clinician-facing as well. We started about 4 years ago. We've got quite a big global footprint now, so about 2.7 million users worldwide. And we've got operations in London and in Rwanda as well, so some really rewarding work going on out there. And just as a kind of demonstration to show you some of the efforts that have gone into creating some of the really innovative, cutting-edge artificial intelligence to augment the clinician's experience, we've got a little demo here to show you. So if we can just have a look at that now.
My name is Dr. Kuntal. Nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
So I can see you've completed our AI assessment. And from this, can I confirm that you've been having dizziness for a few months now, with some hearing loss and also some ringing in your ears?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. You look quite comfortable at the moment. So does the dizziness come and go?
Yeah, I don't have it at the moment.
And when you do get the dizziness, how long do the symptoms last?
A few hours at a time, I'd say.
Okay. And just changing the position.
Okay, and so just to kind of talk you through some of the concepts on there. Just to talk you through some of the concepts that we used in here. So we've got obviously the normal kind of remote digital consultation that you can see with a patient and a doctor. But this is enhanced by lots of features that we've been working on underneath the kind of AI bonnet within the company. So we've got facial recognition of the patient's interaction and responses. Very useful, for example, if the patient may not understand a diagnosis or may not understand the medication that you're talking about, so that you can pick up on that cue very easily. It's also using some natural language generation to recognize the words that that the patient's using and to code the clinical notes and to code the clinical codes that are very important to be coding as well. And then it's using that to put it into the main patient folder, the main patient's notes, so that you've got a full set of notes, including the current consultation. And then you can see at the bottom left, it's helping to create a sort of visual representation of how the patient's organs and systemic health may look, which is a dynamic thing that changes with the current symptoms that the patient may be presenting with.
This is an example of how AI isn't just going to come in and take over doctors' jobs. It's not going to be this either-or thing. AI is going to augment the role that physicians and that people in the healthcare field are going to play rather than totally eradicating it. So in some ways, this could actually give more time back to physicians. So I want to ask you, Roy, can you talk a little bit about how AI might rehumanize this process?
No, I think it may sound counterintuitive to some people that technology can make medicine more humane, but I actually think that it will. If you think about this concept of clinician burnout, that in the medically developed world, between 30 and 80% of clinicians, doctors and nurses have experienced some symptom of burnout, depression, anxiety, even inclination to suicide, lack of motivation in their job. And the psychologists tell us that that's mainly related to not shouldering the burdens of their patients or those sorts of things. It's more related to this concept of losing a human connection with their patients, and that's largely related to the loss of control of their time. And so artificial intelligence has the ability to give time back to clinicians, to eliminate non-clinical activity. So at Philips, we have a platform, for example, called Illumio, that when a clinician is reading x-rays, it can pull up the x-ray of interest, it can find the lesion of interest, it can measure the lesion of interest, it can shorten the time to read that x-ray by 30 to 60%. And if you think about clinical decision support, how that will shorten the time to get to a decision and improve the ability of the clinician to be right the first time. Some of the things that were just shown on the screen here, eliminate rework, giving more time back to the clinician. And if you think about democratizing technology, giving technology to the people in the audience, letting them treat their own conditions, not having to see the clinician at times, that's a lot of time to give back to clinicians that they could potentially spend making a human connection with their patients, interacting with those that by dint of their complex medical problem or their emotional needs that really need that. And so again, another example where you're not replacing the clinician with technology, you're changing the way that they work, and I think it has the promise to make medicine more and not less humane.
So that's what it looks like from the doctor side of how AI is helping doctors, but also it's going to change the way that patients interact with the healthcare system. Hannah, could you maybe talk about how AI is going to change what it's like to be a patient in the future?
Yeah, sure. So I think, and Roy touched on quite a few of these ideas and these concepts. So I think from a patient perspective, it's a really exciting time. There's lots of incredible AI that can actually really influence, where you might go to seek help, who you might seek the help from. And I think that's really key, is when we look at the broader context, it's about, when we look especially about democratizing healthcare and making it accessible for all around the world, it's about getting the right kind of healthcare for the right person at the right time. And if we can achieve that using artificial intelligence, then we're really on to something amazing.
So with the democratization of the access to health, that also takes a lot of data to be able to fuel everything that we're talking about here. And historically, some of these data sets have not been the most accurately produced. They have a lot of implicit biases. Often they have more data on men than women, on white people versus people of color. Could you talk about the importance of data and also how to maybe move forward into a healthier data set ability to be able to funnel into all these new applications?
Sure. Well, to me, it's there are multiple issues here. The first is the one you touch on, and that's the issue of curating the data and making sure that a patient in a bed in a hospital in Leeds in the UK, the data collected from that patient is the same data that's collected from a patient in a hospital bed in Chicago, Illinois. And that's not really the case consistently now. And then you're right. I mean, Obviously, if you can't access healthcare, we can't collect your data. And we do know that access tends to fall along socioeconomic and racial lines in the world. Half the world doesn't have good access to effective healthcare. And so that needs to change as well. And then there's the issue of having enough data to train models. And so a lot of the applications of AI that are currently being used in medicine, and there are many that are being used, and we're using many of them at Philips, a lot of machine learning applications to make sure that machines are maintained effectively and used efficiently, and clinicians working more efficiently is the example I mentioned earlier, and also some early clinical decision support, predicting adverse events and so forth. But to do this really sophisticated clinical decision support, you walk in with a cancer diagnosis and you want your doctor to learn from 10 million people and not just from the 5,000 in their personal database. We've got to pool a lot of data from around the world, and currently business models and philosophies don't really allow us to do that. We don't pool data across healthcare institutions. We don't pool data across borders. And so it's a multi-layer problem. It's got to be curated, it's got to be collected from everyone, and it's got to be pooled. And so we have a lot of work to do to get to that level that's going to really benefit our children and grandchildren in the way that we would like for these tools to benefit.
So there's an infrastructure problem here as much as anything else.
Well, it's an infrastructure problem, but it's also a business model and philosophy problem, I think.
Hannah, could you talk to me a little bit about women's health and femtech and how that ties into this conversation?
Yeah, sure. So, and I think it sort of draws on what Roy was saying. So we need to be working as a group. We need to be working with the academic institutions. We need to be working with the people who have these big sets of data in order for us to be able to use them in clever ways to benefit us as individuals and as society as a whole. We need to be working together and open those dialogues and be as transparent about what we're doing with that data as possible, and use it in, obviously only ethical ways with consent as well. But I think when you think about data and how we use it and bias around it, I think it's a really interesting angle is to think also about how clinicians may be biased, or clinicians may use data, in a human-to-human interaction as well. It's not just with artificial intelligence. So, if I may be speaking with a patient in London who has a fever, I may also be speaking with another patient in Rwanda who has a fever. I may treat them entirely differently, purely based on their demographic region, and maybe using my, clinical judgment and bias to influence that decision. So it's not always a negative thing. I think we can sometimes only look at this with negative connotations associated with it.
So privacy is obviously an issue here as well, that a lot of people come to the table with, whether it is a valid issue or not. Can you talk a little bit about how we can make sure that this data that is being put in, that the people who are supplying it feel like they are safe in doing so?
Sure. Well, it's obviously a significant concern. It should be a concern for every individual. It's a concern, for big companies and small companies and companies in between. We're all concerned about data security. We've all experienced, many of us have experienced breaches in data security in other areas of our lives. I think in the long term, I'm actually quite optimistic about this. I think that there are two considerations that make me feel that way. One is that I think, again, sort of perversely, technology will be the answer for the data security question. Artificial intelligence itself has the ability, with advanced pattern recognition, to really identify abnormal uses of data. And actually, as data pools get bigger and bigger, that capability becomes more and more real. And so I'm quite optimistic that we're going to solve a lot of those data security problems with technology. The second thing is that as we pool this data and we begin to reap the benefits, as we become healthier, imagine the benefits to a company or a government if its employees or its citizens are just 10% healthier. Just 10%. I mean, it's an astronomical benefit financially and existentially to do that. And so I'm sure that there are going to be transgressions. People are going to stick their hand in a candy jar every now and then. But I think over the long term, those benefits are going to be so tremendous that the pressure on those companies and governments to not use this data in the wrong way will overwhelm the desire to do otherwise.
So as we're giving people more control and more power over taking their health into their own hands, you have also self-diagnosis. So when you take the doctor out of it, or if we're replacing part of that situation with AI, then how can we make sure that patients are doing the right thing with what they are learning with that? So could you maybe talk about like what happens after the sessions that they have at Babylon Health?
Yeah, sure. So patients have the option of interacting with, well, actually, if you take this out of that context, patients have the option of interacting with any form of sort of medical advice using the internet, right? You can Google your symptoms, you can go on to various different forums and interact with anybody you'd want to gain advice about your health symptoms. And I think that's where the key to regulating this is now, is that we need to be removing the erroneous advice and making sure that patients are choosing to obtain the advice from regulated places that we know has been medically validated content in it. And that's where, say, at Babylon, for instance, we're constantly validating all of our content. Our machines are learning, yes, but it never goes without a human eye overseeing how that machine learning is happening, so that you don't get that kind of black box spiraling. And I think that that is really important. And it also is so important in order to be able to gain kind of implicit trust of the patients who are using this artificial intelligence moving forward. As a medical professional, we instill implicit trust, in our patients, because we're very transparent and clear and open about how we are trained, what exams we have passed, and we need to be the same with artificial intelligence. We need to be as open and transparent, and open those dialogues with the regulators and the governing bodies to make sure that we can instill this trust in artificial intelligence moving forward.
I'm glad you brought up regulation, because this is clearly going to be an issue with when things do go wrong, because things will go wrong whether AI is involved or not. But then it becomes an issue of, who do you blame? Who takes responsibility? Is it the doctors? Is it the platforms? Is it one of the developers that was working on the AI? Could you maybe talk a little bit about how different people are going about regulation right now, and what you think the most positive way forward would be?
I think we're feeling our way with regulations. This is all very new. And it's moving very quickly. I think that the way I think about regulation is that regulators basically have a patient's best interest at heart. There's a reason why there's a GDPR in the EU. There's a reason why there's a Health and Human Services in the US. They exist to try to protect the health and welfare of individuals. Sometimes they don't move as quickly as we'd like. But the way I think about it, actually, when I'm asked this question, I think about, sort of weirdly, I think about Pablo Neruda, the poet. Mm-hmm. When people ask me if I think regulations are too restrictive or they're moving too slowly, and I think about this quote from Pablo Neruda when he said, "You can cut the flowers, but you can't keep spring from coming." So regulation will catch up with the science, but we have to be patient. And realize that these individuals are regulating these technologies because they're concerned about the safety aspects, and we have to play ball.
So as a final question before we wrap up, what is something that AI will make possible in healthcare that wasn't possible before? Or what are you excited to see happening in the next 10 years that isn't possible now?
I think it will, AI, because of the democratization of information and technology, putting insights directly into the hands of individuals. I think we've emasculated the drive to want to care for ourselves over the last 150 years. I think it will reinstill a sense of responsibility in the general population to care for themselves. And I think that's going to be amazing and tremendous.
And you, Hannah?
I think I agree very much, and I think that we're moving away as society from sick care to wellness now, and how we can empower patients to stay well is really interesting. How can we put so much information into the palm of their hand that they know, if they continue to smoke, they have X percentage risk of developing lung cancer, for instance, or cardiac disease. It's really important that patients are feeling empowered with regards to their health, and I think that will be really key moving forward. And I also think from a women's health perspective, maternity mortality ratios are improving globally, which is brilliant, but there's still a long, long way to go. And I think to meet those sustainable development goals, all of us need to be focused on women's health, pediatric health, not just kind of in the Western world, but in the places where it's really needed as well.
Okay, thank you, Roy, Hannah. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Whoop.